We're here. My name is Mike Jacobs. I retired after 112 years as publisher of the Grand Forks Herald. I've been active in the association ever since they let me in. And I'm happy to be able to moderate this panel. The panel arose from Tim Gallego's objection to the theme of the convention. And he insisted, rightly, I believe, that we need to talk about issues of Native and white folk relations in these states. It can be an uncomfortable conversation, as we all know, and we're going to have that conversation this morning. We have, Tim is unable to be here. Unfortunately, he's had a pacemaker replaced, and his doctor evidently told him that there was no circumstance under which he was allowed to go to North Dakota. Apparently, the doctor thought that was close to a death sentence, so we're not able to have Tim with us, but I know that our thoughts are with him and our good wishes for full recovery, and looking forward to seeing him soon at another of these events. But we do have a distinguished panel. Jody Rave Spotted Bear is from the Fort Berthold community, has a long career in journalism. Scott Davis is the Commissioner of Indian Affairs for the state of North Dakota. And David Flute's title is Secretary of the Tribal Relations for the state of South Dakota. So what I intend to do here is have them each tell you a little bit about their background, and then we'll circle back to me, and I'm going to ask them to give a kind of a statement of principle about what they hope comes out of this, and then we'll start with questions of one another, and we'll invite you all to participate in the questions as well. So, Jody, would you like to start?
Good morning. Again, my name is Jody Rape Spotted Bear. I'm an enrolled citizen of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation. I live in Twin Buttes. I went to journalism school at the University of Colorado at Boulder, and the point of that is I wanted to come back to North Dakota after I got my journalism degree. I had 3 opportunities for newspaper jobs. One was a newspaper in Maine, one was the Idaho Statesman, and one would be to work with Mike Jacobs at the Grand Forks Herald.
She turned me down.
And I really wanted to go work with Mike. But my husband said, Jody, you grew up in North Dakota. You've been there all your life. You should go somewhere else and see what's beyond the North Dakota borders. So I took the job at the Idaho Statesman as a business reporter. And at that time, I had always wanted to report on American Indian issues because I saw the lack of news, especially in communities where there were high populations of Native people, including Montana and North Dakota. And so right out of college, I started pitching to different newspapers like the Billings Gazette and the Bismarck Tribune, and the answer I got from them was, well, they just didn't have any room weren't interested in covering American Indian issues, which is why and my best shot would have been working with Mike, because I know he would have allowed me to do those stories, but I ended up taking the business reporting position. Now, what's interesting to me about that is, I had internships with tribal newspaper in Wisconsin. I had interned at the Oregonian. I had a journalism degree. I interned at the Rocky Mountain News. I was a reporter in the North Dakota Army National Guard, and I couldn't get hired here in North Dakota, but I ended up getting hired because said I didn't have enough experience. One paper said they only hired people with at least 5 years experience. Now, fast forward, the Bismarck Tribune had hired a reporter with basically no experience and sent them down to Standing Rock. Someone without a journalism degree, somebody that had only been on the job for 4 months. But the point of this is we've got a lot of work to be doing here in North Dakota. Just to quickly get back to my journalism experience, I ended up going to the Idaho Statesman and Salt Lake Tribune, and then I had a job offer because my prayers were answered by Lee Enterprises. They eventually hired me. And I was hired to, they asked me if I would be a business reporter, and I said, I got into journalism because I really wanted to cover American Indian news. And they said, okay, let's talk about that. They rescinded the business job, and then they gave me they said, we'd like you to cover American Indian issues, but not just for us at the Lincoln Journal-Star. We want you to do that for the entire Lee newspaper chain. So I did that job, and I loved that job. I did that for 11 years. My last reporting post with Lee Enterprises was at the Missoulian in Montana. But North Dakota is home, and I always wanted to return back to North Dakota, and I'm really happy to be back in my ancestral territory. Since I've been back, I started the Indigenous Media Freedom Alliance, and I can talk more about that, as this panel progresses. But that's kind of a little background on where I come from.
Thank you. Scott?
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Good morning. My name is Scott Davis. My Lakota name is Oshkati Tawa, means celebration. I'm a proud member of the Sailor Rock Sioux tribe on my mother's side, and a proud descendant of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa on my father's side up in the Turtle Mountain area. So currently my daytime job is I serve Governor Burgum as his Indian Affairs Commissioner for the state of North Dakota, basically the liaison between him and our 5 tribal nations here in North Dakota. So that covers a wide array of issues and topics and subject matter and departments, and been doing that for 10 years. I was blessed by then Governor Hovind to be appointed to his position. Obviously worked for him, then Governor Dalrymple, and now with Governor Burgum. So it's a position I hold very personal. It's a challenge. It's a blessing. It's every hour on the hour you're shifting gears. But I was telling Mike, and even my good friend here, my brother here, David, said, over the years you speak to a lot of crowds and different audiences, but this is a first for me. Been interviewed a number of times, obviously through media and so forth, but to talk to a crowd of journalism and reporters, it's a little different. So I'm kind of excited about it. I'll be interested to see what your thoughts are, your perspectives are, and obviously your questions. I totally agree with my sister Jody here. Paying attention to these Native issues for 25 years of my life, working for my tribe for 8 years in Standing Rock. Always a lot of work to do, and I think it's through your help, your voice, your pen, your keyboards that we can turn this thing around. And just one last little something to think about before I turn over to David is my good friend Clay Jacobson we had coffee once in a while. It's been a while, but he said, Scott, this was like about 6 years ago or so. He said, Scott, I don't think North Dakota is ready for these conversations. And I said, well, Dave, I said, well, Clay, I said, you're probably right, but we could be saying that another 10 years from now, 5 years from saying the same thing, that we're not ready for these conversations. So again, Mike, thanks to you association here for bringing us here and having these conversations. So thank you.
Homitaki api, ya akana de was na de yahib ki wopi ya chichi api naha. Chantewa shte na pitchus api. I want to greet each and every one of you with a handshake from my heart. It's good to see everybody gathered here. Naha. Gaktak tokia hitcha Lake Travers Reservation makoche he mataha. I'm from the Lake Travers Indian Reservation, northeast South Dakota. Unka ampetuk de Governor Noam chiab hechtawani. I work for Governor Noam, state of South Dakota, and want to say Nina Wopida, South Dakota Newspaper Association, North Dakota Newspaper Association, Dakuchtaaniti, Woapi Hinakagapta, Nina Wopida Ichichiapi. I appreciate the work that you do and very excited to be here to engage in some race relations conversation. Share a little bit more about myself in the English language. I'm trying to fill some time in for Mike. He said we have an hour and a half, so. But my name is Dave Flute, member of the Sistenuaptan Sioux Tribe. I'm a former chairman down there. I spent 3 years as tribal chairman, 1 year as tribal council member. And meeting Scott Davis, I served at the pleasure of the board for the United Tribes of North Dakota, and very honored and humbled to say that. That's how I got to know Scott very well, and now working as a cabinet member for Governor Noam. I'm an Afghanistan veteran. I served with the South Dakota National Guard in 2007 and 8. Served in Afghanistan. Got deployed with the 235th Military Police Company, and got attached to the 82nd Airborne Division and helped run their Mobile Quick Reaction Force. I see a lot of pens writing, so I'll say this in a jokingly way. Are these statements on record or off the record? But I'm sure they're probably for the record. So I'll be very careful, and it's being recorded. And the reason I say that is to the fellow South Dakotans that are here with me today. I know we have Corey and Sarah here and others that I haven't met yet. Dave is here someplace maybe. But I do want to say I have a lot of respect for USD, our South Dakota universities, but I have a bachelor's degree in history and a Bachelor of Science in Public History from NDSU. Go Bison. So, all right, we got a Bison fan here. So, but no, I say that respectfully. I value education as a historian. Very important to do that research and be very detailed in what you're writing about. So I do have some passion for writing, and I value journalism very much. And I think it's very important that we get the story right, and that it's angled right. And far too often I've seen as a former tribal leader that things get slanted a certain way, and it twists people's thoughts to think of things that are unhealthy. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Mike. And
I'm going to pull a chair up here by the fire, and I'm going to ask Scott to begin the conversation that he alluded to earlier, the conversation that we have to have. The opening is to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Mike. Yeah, the conversations I've had over the years with I'll just start with my colleagues. When you're on the road and you're traveling to a meeting or an event, and it's whether it's a new colleague or an older colleague, you start talking about things. You start talking about your family, your history. You just start talking like human beings do, and how are things in life, and sooner or later we start talking about where you come from, because that's, at least here in North Dakota, that's what we talk about. You know somebody who knows somebody who probably knows somebody. It's that we're pretty tight like that. And then sooner or later you find commonalities, and it's usually family, your upbringing, your culture, and when you start talking about culture, I've come to learn and very appreciate that our culture in North Dakota is very, very personal to us. To be a Scandinavian, Irish, German, Russian, so forth. To me, that's no different being a Lakota and a Anishinaabe, man. I'm very proud of that. That's who God made us that way, If I was born German Russian, I'd probably feel the same way as I do now, you know. So those give me very insights of, gosh, there is a lot of commonality in North Dakota. We don't talk about it. You know, land is another one, water, you know, the farm, the large families, you know, the tight-knit, the closeness that we have as small towns, even some of the behaviors that we have as everybody knows your business, you know, that's how it is. Politics. After church one time, I'm a trustee up at University of Marion. Father Victor and I were talking. He asked me this question, like, well, how did your mom and dad meet? You know, the love story. Well, my dad, you know, was Dickinson grad over here back in the 60s, ran cross-country track, and he's in the Hall of Fame, and also the Blue Hawk recipient. And of course, back in those days, they weren't called the Blue Hawks, they were called the Savages. So there was some interesting days that I've learned through my father. But then he met my mother through one of his good friends, Don Blevins in Standing Rock. And so this love story about Anishinaabe man marrying a Lakota woman is very uncommon. In fact, it was very frowned upon in both cultures that you don't marry them, you don't marry that tribe and so forth. And so even during the wedding, family members didn't attend because they were objecting to the intermarriage of a different tribe. So I was telling Father Victor this, and he said, you know, that's really no different in my culture. He said Catholics and Lutherans, you know, and that you know. And I was just blown away by, wow. So when you look through our lens, right, and I've come to learn and appreciate of all the cultures in North Dakota, for the most part growing up, because maybe we're raised that way because of media, because of TV, whatever, we're taught to look at one lens that every one of you in this room are Caucasian, you're all the same, everything. And I would ask every table here, nope, we're different, because, well, it's the same thing with us. We are different, and that's a good thing. Diversity is a good thing. And so those are the things that I see, and I think maybe vice versa. When you look at us through our lens, you look at our tribes as the same. Well, there's a lot of big differences between us, Lakotas, Dakotas, and the three affiliated tribes. There are similarities as well. But again, these are the conversations I think that should happen and can happen without the mindset that, Scott, I want to ask you something, but I don't want to offend you. You know, is that a place for me to ask? I'm like, shoot it. You know, go right ahead. You know, and I always say that because I'm very comfortable who I am as a Native American man. I know who I am, and I know who I am not. So any question will never offend me. It will never, disturb me or offend me, because to me that's an opportunity to educate you about who we are and who we are not. And I do the same thing with you folks. Like, what's up with the Oli Alina jokes? You know, can I laugh at that? Oh yeah, go right ahead. Well, we have some Oli Alinas in our culture too. So. But I think again, if we take off some of those have the colorblind lenses, you're going to see some beauty. Some beauty, some similarities, some differences. But wow, what a fascinating journey that we could have, continuing this journey about educating who we are, because we're neighbors. You're not moving, I'm not moving. We haven't moved since the inception of time. We've been here. We're indigenous to this land. So these are things that I think, Mike, that again, with your pen and paper, your keyboards, that I'm sure there's a lot of stories you can tell about the similarities that we share here in the Dakotas.
Would you say, any of you, that Native culture is undervalued on the Great Plains, in North Dakota specifically? Your talk, Scott, reminded me of a very large picture of a procession of the heart of St. John Vianney through the cathedral in Bismarck, a sort of a Catholic ritual on steroids. Does that sort of attention to one of the European, for lack of a better term, cultural traditions overshadow coverage or attention to native ceremonials, native processionals and the like? And is that an issue? And any of you are more than welcome to jump into this.
Scott's looking at me like this, so, I just wanted to, I'll start by saying, is Native culture undervalued? The first part of my answer is no. And the reason I say that is, I know being a two-state reservation where I'm from, we're both North Dakota, South Dakota reservation, I know from experience that a lot of the tourists that come into our states, especially those that are from overseas, Norway, Sweden, Germany, and those types of places, they're coming here. At least half of the reason why they're coming here is because they want to see the American Indian culture. I know that for a fact, and my evidence for that is, as chairman, the State Department for the United States of America, State Department was requesting a tribe to host some international museum curators from across the world. And they were looking for a tribe that had the facilities, that had the history. And I say this cautiously, but up here in the Midwest, we're all treaty tribes. And we value that. And a lot of the executive order 280 tribes, they've lost a lot. They lost their language, they've lost their culture, and an example of that, I say respectfully, would be the Pequot tribe out in New England. They don't have their language, and a lot of what they modeled after was our tribes up here in the Midwest. So the State Department was looking for a tribe to host this international group, and they came to Siston. And with our culture, our language, our rich history, they were really intrigued with that. They didn't come here for anything else. They didn't come here to see the rodeos. They didn't come here to see the Stavik House, which is, I think it was some Norwegians, I think, that came in. That I might have wrong. It's either Norwegians or Sweden's immigrants that came in the 1900s, and it's in my hometown. But the people from Norway and Sweden, they didn't come to see, a house that these immigrants from their countries came and established. They wanted to come see the Indians. And I see that in North Dakota as well, too. Another example that I share why I believe that Native culture is valued, it's not undervalued, is the 3 busloads of Germans and different Europeans that came to our tribes and did tours amongst our tribes. So I don't think our culture is undervalued in that sense, but I don't think it is supported. It's not supported in the ways it could be to enhance tourism and enhance education of our cultures. And I have a good friend, I'm not going to mention his name, but I have a good friend that he served in Afghanistan. He's from the home state of South Dakota, but it took him being in Afghanistan to experience that culture to come back home and say, man, I seen a couple of the same colors that the tribes in South Dakota use, and he became intrigued. And so that's where I feel there's, maybe an education gap there that needs to be bridged in building better race relations, or, as Scott said, being comfortable to being asked tough questions. But I don't believe our culture is undervalued, because tourism is a big moneymaker. And when you have people coming in to look at the vibrant colors of the fancy dance, or the sound of the jingle dress, and the bells of the traditional dancers, and the harmonic melodies of the singers and the drums, it's not easy. Scott's been a dancer, and I've danced, I sing, and it's not easy. I don't know how to square dance either, but this guy was saying we have to pick a number here, and we got to pick a partner, and so you know, but it excites me, you know, and I also think that we could flip the script a little bit and ask ourselves as tribes, you know, is our South Dakota culture undervalued? You know, we look at hunting and fishing, you know, and those types of, you know, Mount Rushmore. And here's where we start getting into that race relations of the Black Hills and how they were taken. And people on both sides need to be educated of those emotions and those reflections, and they really need to intersect there, and they got to cross those roads, they got to cross those bridges. So I don't think you know, the culture is undervalued. I just think there's ways we can improve, you know, enhancing, acknowledging, you know, the culture and making sure it's presented out there. So,
Jody, what's your take on this question?
Okay, I won't say Doug because Dave said everybody calls him Doug Flutie. And Dave Flute. So David mentioned how there, he doesn't, from his perspective, our native cultures aren't undervalued, but I think what we should take out of that is he mentioned that it was foreigners that probably appreciate the native culture in North Dakota and South Dakota more than the white people that live in this state. If it were valued more, we would see more of it reported in the newspapers. So kind of getting back to, I believe Scott had mentioned diversity and the importance of diversity. You know, there is no diversity in this room. I don't think there's a single American Indian reporter working for any of the daily newspapers. We got a hand. I have to ask this person who she is. Do you mind saying what newspaper you're from?
Good morning, everyone. My name is Elena Duplo. I work for the West River Eagle newspaper out of Ely on the Cheyenne Reservation.
Great.
I also freelance for the Native Son newspaper.
Okay, so we have one representative. Are you a weekly newspaper?
Yeah, our weekly newspaper.
Okay, all right. I think that there could be more diversity in our mainstream press. So she's in Eagle Butte on the Cheyenne River Reservation, which is actually where my father is from. But you know, back to that the issue of undervaluing our is there value or is our culture undervalued? I'd say from the media perspective, and speaking to you as a journalist, it is extremely undervalued, and I'll have to address some of the issues that inspired Tim Gallego to ask for this panel. And you know, unfortunately, he does have some health issues, but I did call him up today to see how he's doing. He had a surgery yesterday, and he sounded pretty good today. I asked him, is there any message, Tim, that you want me to relay to all your colleagues there at the newspaper conference and on this panel? And he, right away, he said, you know, there was just a story in the Rapid City Journal recently, and it had to do with Medal of, an individual wanted to honor all the Medal of Honor recipients in, I believe, South Dakota, and they were going to do it at the, have an exhibition or something at the mall. I didn't read the story because Tim just told me about this, you know, about 20 minutes ago. He was very upset because of all the Medal of Honor winners in South Dakota, the organizer also wanted to include the 20 Medal of Honor recipients that got medals for the massacre at Wounded Knee. And Tim's paper in the Native Son News addressed that particular issue, and he said the response was overwhelming. He said, you know, they had thousands hits on the story and comments, and somehow I think this circulated back to the organizer, and that exhibit, I believe, isn't going to happen anymore. Jack, you might know more about that particular story, but I think that is really an example. Oh, and Tim's issue was, not only was this going to happen, but the story apparently was a front page Rapid City Journal story, and they never contacted a single American Indian source on that issue. Unfortunately, North Dakota and South Dakota newspapers have a long history of undervaluing the history, the culture, the massacres. Another issue Tim brought up was the genocide of American Indian people. I live in Twin Buttes on the Fort Berthold reservation. That community is largely the Nuita or the Mandan. And this little Missouri River actually marks one of the northernmost boundaries of my tribe. So this is really part of our ancestral homelands. We came up here, we had our winter camps up here. I'm pretty sure I'd be pretty hard pressed to find that mentioned around this park anywhere. But this is the power of the media, and this is the reason why I even decided to become a journalist when I was in high school, is to educate. And one of our panelists here had mentioned the power of the media and how we can educate people. I think that another example of how our culture was undervalued and not reported accurately was with Standing Rock. And we can go back to that particular issue, because I could probably talk a long time on the news coverage of Standing Rock, but it became very divisive. I as an American Indian, I could cite a number of examples of how that really heightened or created a greater tension in race relations between American Indians in the state and non-natives. There may have been a few stories reported in the media on that particular issue.
One of the issues that occurs to me, having listened to what's been said, is I've worked in North Dakota media for a long time, and I trust the hearts of all of the people in the room. I don't think there's a sense that we get up in the morning and say we're going to ignore Native issues, or we're not going to respect Native traditions and that sort of thing. But there is a problem, I think, in there's a little bit of reluctance about making the step, because it's the conversation that has to happen, but everybody sort of shies away from. And I think a lot of the terms are different. Dave made reference to treaty tribes and public law tribes. I don't know that I almost cold called somebody in the room and said, one of the reporters, and said, explain what that means. I think there's a lot of lack of understanding about how the Native societies are organized, how the Native governments operate, and who is the person to turn to when issues like Standing Rock occur. I think it was news to a lot of North Dakotans when Standing Rock occurred that there was a treaty claim involved. There were legitimate cultural sites involved. It would be, in a rough sense, equivalent to putting a pipeline through a graveyard in a German-Russian community. So I think that we need to know, and the question I'm raising is, who do we turn to when these sorts of issues arise, and we confront the ignorance that we have grown up with about the people that we live with?
I think there's a number of people. You got 3 of them right here that are pretty easy to approach on questions and, how come this, why that. I think it's, for some, I think, maybe I'm assuming here too with some of the reporters there, how do you report Native news in any country, from a Caucasian eye perspective? How do you do that? I mean, maybe that's where we start, but it'd probably be more different than Jody as a Native American reporting on mainstream American business as a business reporter. Maybe you don't grow up that way. So where do you start? So I think that in itself, I think, is an interesting place to start. And obviously, there's a lot of people resources that are willing to hold you by the hand and take you where you want to go, and where it's, I guess, a process of trust. Because I think even for me, just as Joe citizen, when I get asked from reporters, it's a trust issue. It always has been for me, and it's taken me years and a number of reporters to where I gain their trust, because what I say and what's on the record, what's off the record, is important to me. Because this is a reflection of who I am. It's a reflection of my people. Is it going to stir the pot? Is it going to do all these things? Is it going to disrupt some things? Maybe, maybe not. So I have this really trust thing with reporters, with journalism, and so forth. But I'm going to knock on wood here. It's been good, because but I do go back to the pieces like, the old question of, how come there's so much alcoholism on the reservation? I'm like, well, probably the same reason why there's a lot of alcoholism in North Dakota, or binge drinking in North Dakota, it's those commonalities again I'm talking about. But I think that's, for me, there's a lot of resources. You got tribal leaders, former chairman here, council members, tribal college presidents. My father is just retired from one, who have a vast history. The baby boomers have a vast history who are kind of sitting there twiddling their thumbs down like my father and says, I want to keep doing something here. I need some more work here, part-time work. Those people have humongous. The baby boomers have huge layers and layers of history that will take you by the hand and walk you through a POW if it is, or go through the business part. I mean, whatever it is that you want, it's there. It's there for your taking. It's there for your pen and paper. It's there for your keyboard to look into. And maybe it's controversial. Maybe it's how come this, how come that, but we got to ask those questions, And there are certainly a lot of credible people in the country that can give you a very strong perspective on things, or an education perspective on things, or historical whatever. But I mean, it's there. It is certainly there. But again, I think that story, how we tell our story, is one. I think maybe most of you scratch your heads like, hey, John Doe, would you mind heading down to Stand Rock and doing a story on this? Sure, but where do I go to? And I get those questions asked a lot. A lot. Hey, I'm heading down to Stand Rock. Here's a story. Who do I need to talk to? Well, for me, that's in North Dakota. I may 9 out of 10 times know the story or know the issue. Yeah. Well, here's probably the person you want to talk to. That you're going to get a story. And of course, you're going to have your public perception. That may say something off the wall sometimes. It happens. Whatever. But it's there, like I said. So I think there's opportunity for that. There's connections with our offices, with Jody. Obviously, Jody has a big network too, but it is certainly there.
When I was in 7th grade, back in 1893, we learned about the structure of civil government. Everybody in the room, every North Dakotan in the room, over 30 or 40, was schooled on Conrad Leifer's book, Our State, North Dakota. We learned all about county government, and we learned all about city government. We learned all about school boards and so on. But I don't recall learning anything about tribal government. So the question that I would raise is there a systemic problem in that we are producing people in our public school systems or wherever who have not incorporated this other government structure in our educational systems, which could go a ways to explaining why reporters coming out of journalism schools are not aware of where to turn for information, or of what the nuances in a situation might be. Jody, do you want to?
So to answer that quickly, the education isn't. I don't see it taking place in our public schools, and I can speak from firsthand experience because my 11-year-old daughter attends a public school on our reservation, and there's no culture taught in that because it's just not a part of the curriculum. Now, being from North Dakota and having lived in other states like Nebraska and Idaho and most recently coming from Montana, there is a stark difference between the educational systems in North Dakota and Montana. Their constitution actually is mandated that they teach contemporary and historical history of American Indians. It is in their state constitution. Now, albeit it took them a few decades to actually put any money, it took decades for the state legislature to put any money into the act called Indian Education for All. But once they did that under Governor Brian Schweitzer, it's, I would say, really flourishing in there because Indian educators in Montana had been working for decades because they knew this was in the Constitution, so they were building their curriculums and handing that off to teachers. And it's really taking off, and I don't see anything like that happening in my home state of North Dakota.
Just to add to that a little bit, DPI and my office, we have been working on a curriculum called the Essential Understandings through DPI, and right now it's offered as an elective to the school systems in North Dakota, but I go back to the school boards, whether it's Bismarck, Beach, whatever. I think locally, that local control thing again, is the school board offered this? Is it being promoted? And that's another thing that we've been looking at internally here with our offices, is that how do we promote this now that because we did a long 2-3 year process of interviewing educators, Indian educators, and also elders about the true history of our people. And so that's out there, but I don't think it's promoted enough, back to Jody's point, to be offered in a local public school. And believe me, I have the same stories from my daughter about other cultures. Like one day she came home, she said, "Daddy, how come the Blackfeet people are they're bad people, Daddy? They're bad." I said, what do you mean? I said, well, in our history book today, my teacher said that they're bad people because they stole horses. So here's another 1 page and a half story in the history book. And the thing is that the Blackfeet people are the boogeyman again. It's like, okay, here we go again. And in my position, it just drives me up the wall because we're working hard to promote, to educate, to change the history, the real history of our people. And it's a daunting task, but there's a little effort, but we model those things after Montana, South Dakota, all those things. But it's going to take a little bit more effort for our state to get back on par, and maybe that's a good story for you to follow up on, I must say.
Yes, please.
So the impetus for today's discussion was an unintended but obvious insensitivity on our part in this convention. So I guess from a very base level, how can we be better? We got every editor and publisher from the Dakotas here. Like, what do we need to do to better represent people that we're telling stories about and our communities?
Okay, there's quite a few answers for that. We could start off, or you could start off by reaching out to any of the Native communities in your area. Try to diversify your newsrooms. Let's see here. Diversify the newsrooms, and I think it really kind of goes back to something even more at a base level, and that is understanding our own discrimination, our perspective of discrimination, our own prejudices. I have this book. I don't know if anybody has seen this particular. It's called White Fragility, Why It's So Hard for White People to Talk About Racism by Robin DiAngelo. Has anybody read the book or seen the book? I think I see one person nodding their head. I'd say that everybody here, because we all have our own prejudices. I have my own prejudices. Everybody here does, just by perspective of being a human being and the way that we're raised and the cultures that we come from and our different world points of view. But unless we really get a clear understanding of the genocide of American Indians, you will never make room for that in your reporting if you don't understand where it is, why you're not even covering American Indian issues in the first place. Now, we do still carry the effects of historical trauma, and I think that needs to be better understood and reported by our local newspapers. But reach out to, I would say, if there are some local newspapers in your area or tribal newspapers, I think it would be very helpful to create a relationship with, reporters at the MHA Times or the Teton Times in South Dakota or the Native Sun News, because we know our communities probably better than anybody. So why not go to the sources of the people that are on the ground and doing the work? So I'd say that would be a key element. Now, I just wrote a report for the Democracy Fund, and it is about the state of American Indian media. It was published last fall. If you go to the Democracy Fund website and just look for the Native Media Report, it examines some of the issues that are happening and the lack of news coverage. Now, I'm not going to just say it's all the mainstream press's fault for not reporting on us, because we don't even do a good job of it ourselves, but there's a reason for that. About 70% of all print and radio is owned by tribes. So we have a big issue of censorship in Indian country. We can't even really tell our own stories. I live on the Fort Berthold Reservation, where we have hundreds of millions of dollars in oil royalties and revenues that are going into each of our segments, White Chill, Twin Buttes, Mandaree. And as a community member, none of us know how that money is being spent. There is no accountability, there is no transparency among our own people. With the tribe controlling the media, we can't go to the council and say, how did you spend that $13 million that just went to your little community of 500 people last year? How are you spending that $10 million you got the year before? And how are you spending that, that's just one small segment of the money. There's hundreds of millions being spent on special projects. How is that? We're not getting the stories, which is one reason why I even went and decided not to report for tribal media right out of college, because I knew I couldn't really tell that story with the tribe controlling our newspapers. So I chose to work for the mainstream press. And, you know, it kind of puts you out of the reach of being fired for actually going back into the community and being able to tell those stories. Not that there wasn't a councilman in the past, or several, that did want me fired, but I didn't get the facts wrong and the story was right. I had to talk with one of my editors at the Missoulian after I had reported on some issues at Fort Berthold on misspending money and vote buying and et cetera. And that tribal leader had contacted a legal firm. They sent a letter to my editor, and they wanted me fired. And so we had to go over all the facts of the story, and they said, Jody, you didn't get any of the facts wrong. They just don't like your story, so we're going to keep writing. You're going to keep writing about these particular issues. So the mainstream media could do us a big favor because we don't really have those opportunities to tell those stories. And that's one of the reasons why I founded the Indigenous Media Freedom Alliance, to support freedom of the press and freedom of information. It's going to be a long road in supporting the independent media operations that do exist. Those are the ones that where the tribes don't control the purse strings. But yeah, just cultivating the relationships with the reporters that are trying to do the work and getting more stories out there.
We'll just chime in real quick. I just, respectfully, as a former leader, and I'm going to share a story with you about, what my comments are. Is I take issue with some of our tribal news media outlets. They just don't check their resources, and I'm not saying all of them, but that doesn't help contribute to, part of the question you asked was, how can we do a better job? I think in sharing, the code or the ethical, things you need to follow, making sure your sources are accurate. During our state tribal relations day in the state of South Dakota, we, Scott Davis was, we were at the North Dakota Heritage Museum there, and Scott was replacing the tribal flags, and I brought a tribal flag up, and somehow in a discussion, Chairman Fox, very good friend of mine, Dave Arshamble was the chairman then, we started talking a little bit about, flags being hung up in the North Dakota Capitol. This was about 3 years ago. The seed was planted, and seeing that this last session, Governor Burgum had, displayed the tribal flags out. And so when I took office in South Dakota for Governor Noem, she had asked, do you know how that came about? And I shared with her the story, and she said, geez, I'd really like to do that for our tribes in South Dakota. And at a Great Plains Tribal Chairman Association meeting, all of them are my friends. I went there and I shared with them that, the governor at some point down the road, would like to display the 9 tribes of South Dakota, their flags, in our capital, Rotunda. And there's kind of a process that, you have to go through before there's the beautification committee that, they have to approve those things and on the Capitol grounds. And we went through some steps, and I shared it with the area chairman. They were all happy about it, and the governor merely made an announcement at our state tribal relations day that at a time in the future, we'd like to have the tribes bring their tribal flags in, and we'd honor them in a formal flag ceremony. And nobody said anything. Everybody was on the same page. A few weeks later, a couple bills were dropped that were passed by the legislative body in South Dakota, and the tribes got upset with a couple of those bills, and And the next thing you know, I'm getting calls from chairmen, and I see it on the front page of some tribal papers that the tribes want their flags back. And I was being asked by the chairman, can you give us our flag back? We don't want it hung up in the rotunda. And I had asked, what flag are you talking about? And they said, well, the ones you guys hung up in the rotunda. And I said, we didn't hang any of your tribal flags up in the rotunda. But Indian news media twisted the story, and that's why I take, offense to that. And as a chairman, having my comments be slanted in a different tone than what I was giving it to the reporter, really changed the dynamic of how people receive that information and my intentions of how it was coming out and the intentions I had of people receiving it and the way I wanted them to receive it. It was completely twisted by my own Indian people, so it's, to try to answer your question, what can you do to do better? I think, reporting on some of those same issues as tribes, that tribal newspapers are reporting and just showing that, you did your fact checking and you checked your resources and I think non-native news media could have helped kind of dampen the fury out there by the tribes that wanted their flags back. I just wanted to chime in a little bit too about who do you turn to when Indian issues arise. I would think starting with the tribal leadership first would be your first, to just show that respect to that tribal nation. Just saying, hey, I'm a reporter with the Capital Journal. I want to do a story on whatever's happening, constitutional reform or whatever it is. We know down in Pine Ridge they're having a big constitutional reform, and we heard Mike talk about maybe this education gap here of students learning about tribal government. We move up to the Howard Wheeler Act, Indian Reorganization Act at 34, and that's kind of where it stopped with tribes. My tribe, you don't see much history written between 34 to probably 72, right before Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act came out. So, and that's when tribes really started exercising their right to self-governance and really asserting their sovereignty. But who to turn to is very, very challenging. And I don't want to stereotype, because you might find some common tribal member on the street that maybe doesn't, have a vest on or a piece of beadwork, but man, he got a lot of good information and he's reasonable and he's going to be fair and objective. Whereas you might get some real extremists out there that want to be completely radical to slant that story a certain way. So very, very hard job you have with the world we're living in here today. And I'm not a fan of social media. I just it's just really disheartening. It's I think there's some healthy stories that get put out there, some healthy statements, but I've seen a lot more unhealthy behaviors and statements that are, they're really disgusting, and it doesn't help with race relations. But those are just some of the comments I wanted to make, and I think you have a very tough job. And who do you turn to? I would start with tribal leadership and maybe a tribe's communication director. I'd also reach out to tribal newspaper, the editors of tribal newspapers, and give them the heads up. Cecile?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on something that Jody said that really struck me as a reporter, and how I would approach doing a story about Native issues. So, in a controversial topic, if you were to go into the tribal government or try to explain a Native issue, and it'd be very controversial, and it would almost, there's almost a line of, okay, are we being oppressive in coming in and trying to tell your community what's going on in your tribal government? That's a really fine, difficult line to tread. especially given the lack of background that most of us have, as you've discussed. So I think there's almost a fear on the part of Caucasian reporters that, like, how dare I come into your community and try and report what you're experiencing. And with all the different factions, you know, you could get a source that was more than happy to tell you all about this issue, and there could be another faction on the other side that's going to read that story and say, boy, that lady don't know what she's talking about. So I think it's a really tall mountain to climb to even try to approach a controversial topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with everything that you're saying. Even as a Native person, myself going into my own community is difficult. But this is where it's really important to get to know tribal communities and really understand and know who your reliable sources are. I agree with what Dave said, reach out to, out of respect, if you're going to do a controversial story, do reach out to a tribal leader, but don't hold your breath. Because, I know, having covered American Indian communities, some tribes are light years ahead in their public relations departments than other tribes. I think every tribe should have a reliable public relations person, but that is not always the case. It's really hit and miss, and that's why I say don't hold your breath. I also wanted to address something that Dave had mentioned, about Native reporters getting the stories wrong. I would say that goes just to the lack of education. Of the 30-some tribal colleges in the United States, there's only one that has a communications program, and that's Haskell University in Kansas. So our Native journalists aren't getting, the proper training. They're probably doing the best that they can. Now, Jack Marsh here is in the room, and I'd like to say that in my career, if it weren't for people like Jack Marsh and Mike Jacobs, they have really done some amazing work in fostering the development of young Native reporters. Jack oversaw the American Indian Journalism Institute, which was funded by the Freedom Forum. And they just did some amazing summer training programs at the University of South Dakota, and a lot of those people are still fellow journalists, Native colleagues of mine, excellent reporters that were really taught and mentored through that training program, and like in college, and pipelined into different internships. And so, this is what we want to see, is the good training of our Native journalists that can go back into our communities and write the controversial stories. But we have a mountain to climb when tribes own the majority of our print and radio, and they're not calling out for transparency and accountability. When our tribal colleges aren't even teaching journalism, we do need the reporters, and that would be the mainstream press, to really knuckle down and get to know these communities and write the controversial stories, because you would do that in your own community. If you have, a governor that's, ready to be indicted on some corruption charges, they're not going to open up the door and give you all the information that you need. You're going to have to work for it. And that would be the same in our communities.
Let me be sure that we get questions that might be out there. Yes.
I guess it's really a question as much as a suggestion. So I'm Kathy Nelson from Medora, from the Cheyenne River Reservation, a very mixed community in our region. But I'm putting together a couple of things that were said. So as part of the problem
that wasn't really a question, so thank you for the comment. Yes, please.
Jeremy Waldner from a newspaper in southeastern South Dakota, small community north of Yankton. It seems like on the national level, we've gone backwards in terms of race relations. My opinion, a lot of that has to do with our current administration. My question to you is, in the Dakotas, have we gone backwards in terms of race relations between the Caucasians and the American Indians? Or have there been positive steps taken? And if so, what are those positive steps? And perhaps we need to look at those to build on as opposed to try to reinvent the wheel.
That's a really good question, and I think what really spurred that was the our protest with my tribe and DAPL. I mean, I think every news outlet in this planet was there at one time or another, and countless interviews and phone ringing off the hook for some interview, and finally I just said enough. I'm not taking any interviews, but what that did, I think, there was beauty in that, and there was ugliness in that. For those that were there day in, day out, from a travel side, I mean, what a beautiful gathering to see my people gathered that way, early on. And I don't think it was so much the pipeline itself, it was just the gathering of relatives, to share stories and to, rekindle just through fellowship. That was a beautiful thing, and I thought this is how in the country should be, like we once were. But then there was story after story, blogs, Facebook, and I use the analogy of our fixture in our culture is Iktomi. Iktomi is the spider, the trickster, and Iktomi was very powerful during that time through social media, weaving his web. And through social media, through Facebook, and you watch Facebook explode, and all the comments and the bad and it just all went off, I'm like, wow, this is really exposed. To my whole question, living and growing up here, I'm also a Mandan City Commissioner, and I'm like, wow, is this really how we are? Is this really a reflection of the true meaning of my inner feelings about racism, about the white man, about the red man? I mean, is this it? Versus where we just had this imaginary line we've come a long way in that, is that we don't cross that. We've just learned to live with each other and think, okay, well, once in a while somebody will cross it and it gets stupid and racism, discrimination, but for the most part, where I live, where I came from, there was always this imaginary boundary. But I think what the protest did, it really elevated the racism, the prejudice, the unknowns, the stereotypes, the history on both sides of our races. New administration, I agree with you. I totally agree with you. I think we've taken a lot of steps back in our race relations with across America. And that's where it takes really true leadership, I think, to face that in the forefront. Whether it's a tribal chairman, your council, your president, your governor. I mean, I got to applaud my governor for doing what he did. And that's the other part of the Paul Harvey, if you will. The other part of the story is just that. We experienced that. We learned from it. I think it's broadened our perspective of how come this? What is a treaty land? What's a treaty tribe? Why they so upset over water? What's a water protector? All those things, as controversial as they were, I think now they're in a much better place, because now we're really discovering of what that is. And there's a reason why we're upset when it comes to our water. Probably the biggest lesson I learned with water is that, who carries us for 9 months? Our mothers. Where does she carry us in? Water. That's colorblind as it could be. And when the water breaks, where does the water go? It goes to the ground. So that's our connection. That's my connection with water and with Mother Earth. That's always going to be there with me. I think that's such a simple analogy for every human in this world to understand and to maybe agree with. But I think with leadership, with my governor, and David and I talk about this because he's in the middle of that now too, and I pray for him every day, is that sometimes you need to go there. You need to go down there or up there. I mean, even during the plight of DAPL, I had my travel leaders that were didn't want to come up to the Capitol, didn't want to come to Mandan, didn't want to come to Bismarck to discuss how are we going to get past this. You know, because maybe it was fear, maybe it was politically pulled. Like you don't go up there, you don't talk to the enemy. You don't go down to Standing Rock. What are you, crazy? You talk to those people? No, we have to. And you're going to get a little bit of this. You know, when Governor Burgum, when he first came on board, he said, "What do we need to do, Scott?" I said, "We need to go down there. We need to go down there and talk. Not so much talk, but listen. Listen." And Governor, you're going to get a lot of this, but that's okay. Just listen, and it'll run its course. It'll subside. But at the end of the day, you're going to get your respect because you're there. And I think we as human natures need that. Yeah, there's stuff that's burning on my chest that I don't like about government and so forth and whatever. And where do I vent? Do I vent on the keyboard again? Do I put it up in the cloud? You know, and I think that's the other piece of this is what they told me is that all this stuff is in the cloud. You know, it's up there. It's not here on earth. It's not face to face. It's not eye to eye. And so I've always challenged, you know, some of the political bloggers out there. I see that on your blog you have a lot of these likes and hearts and all this stuff, and that's good. But let me ask you something. Are you winning? Are you moving the needle on that issue? Whatever that issue may be. Native issue, non-native issue. Are you talking to the powers that be? You know, are you sitting at the table? Are you having coffee with them? Are you having a chance, a moment to take the time to understand their side of the story, the Paul Harvey of it? That's what we need to do. Otherwise, we're just gonna blog. I'm gonna blog about you, you're gonna blog about me, and it's to me it's irrelevant because it doesn't change. It's an emotional, very strong emotional feeling that somebody really likes my story or my blog or my whatever that is, my Facebook hit, whatever that is. But to me, the reality is that to change these issues in America and in the country, we need to sit down and talk about these things and negotiate. And believe me, I've been through a lot of negotiations, heated negotiations, passionate, and that's good. That's good because that tells me that we want the same thing, and we're willing to come back to the table again and again to find a commonality. And when that happens, it's a beautiful thing. And I really think that's what we need in this country. Absolutely.
That brings us to one of my favorite shared experiences, which is a gift-giving ceremony. And we have gifts for you to thank you. I hope that people in the room will come and visit with the panelists. I know that there's more to be said and there's more to be asked. That's the way a difficult conversation proceeds. I think that the answer to what's the way forward, it's to take the step, to ask the questions, to reach out to one another. And I hope that this panel has been one of those steps. So thank you very much to the panelists. Dave, I'm cutting you off because I got the hook from my boss. But I know there are people in the room who want to hear what you have to say, so others need to move on. So let's continue the conversation. Thank you all very much for being here.